Dr. Yevakorsk had spent 19 years perfecting an instrument she now suspected did not work, and the suspicion had arrived, as these things often did, at the worst possible moment. She stood in the observation gallery aboard the Imperial cruiser Ascendant Word, watching a bank of monitors display the biometric and behavioral readings streaming in from the newly arrived human delegation, and felt the particular cold unease of a scientist watching her life's work fail to produce the numbers it was supposed to produce. The threshold assessment, as her department called it, had been refined across 4 centuries of first contact encounters. A standardized measure of vocal stress patterns, ship formation tightness, communication response delay, and a dozen subtler variables, all calibrated to produce a single, reliable figure, a species fear response, quantified, predictable, and, in Korsk's professional experience, almost never wrong. It had correctly assessed the Thren's cautious deference on first contact. It had correctly predicted the Vashtar's aggressive bluster masking genuine terror. It had, across 41 documented encounters, never once returned a result that later contact proved fundamentally mistaken. It was, at this moment, returning nothing at all. "Run it again," Korsk said, to the junior technician monitoring the primary console. "I've run it 4 times, Doctor," the technician said, not looking up from her display. "Vocal stress markers are flat. Formation tightness is within normal operational parameters, not the compressed defensive posture we'd expect under threat assessment. Response delay is consistent with routine bureaucratic correspondence, not crisis negotiation. The instrument isn't malfunctioning, Doctor. It's telling us these readings are accurate." Korsk studied the flat, unremarkable data on the screen and felt something considerably worse than professional frustration settle into her chest. She had joined the Threshold Assessment Program as a junior researcher, fresh from her doctoral studies, drawn to the work by its promise of genuine, quantifiable insight into one of the most consequential questions any first contact encounter posed. How would a newly discovered species actually respond, when the full weight of Imperial presence made clear exactly how much power disparity existed between them? For centuries of accumulated data had refined the assessment into something her department regarded, with justified professional pride, as one of the Empire's most reliable diplomatic tools, a framework that had, time and again, allowed Imperial commanders to calibrate their approach with a precision that avoided both unnecessary conflict and unnecessary concession. She had built her entire career on the assumption that fear, properly measured, told you almost everything you needed to know about how a new species would behave under pressure. Watching the human delegation's readings return, flatly, a picture that matched nothing in 4 centuries of prior data, she found herself confronting the particular, disorienting vertigo of a scientist realizing that her life's foundational assumption might simply be wrong, for reasons she did not yet understand. The human ships had arrived 6 hours earlier, 3 modest vessels holding position at the edge of the contested Vessic Corridor, a resource-rich system both the Empire and this newly encountered species had, independently, begun surveying for potential claim. Fleet Commander Dressa Vorn, overseeing the encounter from the Ascendant Word's command deck, had executed the Empire's standard first contact protocol with the practiced precision of an officer who had conducted this exact procedure 11 times over the course of her career: full weapons charge, synchronized formation display, an ultimatum broadcast across every frequency the human vessel's communication arrays appeared capable of receiving. The human response, when it finally arrived, was not fear, was not retreat, and was not, as Vorn's own instincts had briefly hoped, capitulation. It was a request for a meeting. "They've sent a shuttle, Commander," her communications officer reported. "Single occupant. Unarmed, by every scan we've run. They're requesting a face-to-face discussion regarding resource allocation in the corridor." Vorn had expected many possible responses to the Empire's opening display. She had not expected this one, and the particular flatness of Korsk's instrument readings, streaming in alongside the tactical reports, did nothing to resolve her growing unease. "Grant the meeting," Vorn said. "And get Dr. Korsk down to the reception deck. I want her reading on this before we proceed any further." Vorn had commanded this exact opening sequence 11 times across her career, against species ranging from cautiously deferential to openly hostile, and had come to trust her own instincts, honed alongside Korsk's instrumentation, as a reliable guide for calibrating whatever came next. What unsettled her now, waiting for the shuttle to complete its approach, was not any specific behavior the human vessels had displayed, but the particular absence of behavior she had learned, over more than a decade of first contacts, to expect as a matter of course: the hesitation, the defensive repositioning, the careful, anxious probing typically encoded into even the most confident species' opening response. The human ships had simply held position, weapons powered down, and waited, with the same unhurried patience one might extend toward a delayed but expected delivery, rather than an armed fleet capable of ending their existence with a single coordinated strike. "Commander," her tactical officer said, as the shuttle cleared final approach, "for what it's worth, I've reviewed the shuttle's flight telemetry twice now. It's not evasive. It's not cautious. It's flying the most direct, efficient approach vector available, exactly as though it were docking at a routine trade station rather than a fleet that just ran a full intimidation sequence at them." "Noted," Vorn said, and found, saying it, that she did not entirely trust her own voice to carry the composure she intended. The human envoy who stepped off the shuttle was younger than Korsk had expected, a woman perhaps in her early 30s, wearing a simple, unadorned uniform that carried none of the ceremonial weight the Empire's own diplomatic corps typically favored for first encounters of this significance. "Fleet Commander Vorn," the woman said, extending a hand in the particular human gesture Korsk's briefing materials identified as a customary greeting. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo, representing the Sol Survey Authority. Thank you for agreeing to meet." Vorn regarded the extended hand for a moment before accepting it, a small, deliberate pause that Korsk noted with professional interest, the kind of hesitation the threshold assessment would typically read as a dominance signal, though she found herself watching Okonkwo's entirely unbothered reaction to it, uncertain whether the signal had registered at all. "Lieutenant," Vorn said, "I trust you understand the significance of the Empire's presence in this corridor." "I do," Okonkwo said. "We've reviewed the Empire's territorial claims filed with the regional trade registries. We'd like to propose a straightforward split, 50-50 division of the corridor's surveyed resource deposits, with a joint monitoring protocol to prevent over-extraction on either side. I've brought the relevant survey data, if you'd like to review it before we discuss terms further." Korsk, standing slightly behind Vorn's shoulder with her monitoring equipment quietly recording every measurable variable the encounter produced, found herself struck by the sheer, almost bureaucratic ordinariness of Okonkwo's proposal, delivered with the same unhurried, practical tone a person might use discussing a shared utility bill, rather than the tone Korsk's entire career had trained her to expect from a species facing the full weight of Imperial first contact posturing. "You understand," Vorn said, her own composure carrying a faint but perceptible edge, that the Empire's claim in this corridor is backed by considerable military presence. I would ask whether your government has fully considered the implications of a 50-50 proposal, given that disparity. Okonkwo did not hesitate. We have, Commander. I'd note that we're not proposing this split because we doubt your capability to enforce a larger claim by force. We're proposing it because we think a negotiated 50-50 split produces a more stable, mutually productive outcome than either of us spending resources contesting the corridor indefinitely. I'm not here to test your resolve, Commander. I'm here to see if we can save both our governments considerable expense and risk. Vorn studied her for a long moment, searching, Korsk suspected, for whatever subtle tell her own considerable field experience typically relied upon in place of Korsk's instruments. She found, evidently, nothing that satisfied her, because her next question carried a note of genuine, rather than merely tactical, curiosity. May I ask you something directly, Lieutenant, outside the formal terms of this negotiation? Your fleet held position against a full Imperial intimidation display without so much as a change in formation. I have conducted this exact opening sequence 11 times in my career, against considerably more established powers than your own. I have never once seen a response quite like this one. Okonkwo considered the question for a moment, something almost gentle entering her expression. I understand the question, Commander, and I don't think it's an unfair one to ask. I'd only say this, the absence of a reaction isn't the same thing as an absence of understanding. We saw exactly what your display was designed to communicate. We simply didn't think reacting to it with visible alarm would improve either of our positions in the conversation that needed to follow it. I'd be happy to discuss that further if you're genuinely curious, but I suspect the resource terms are the more pressing matter for today. Vorn inclined her head, filing the answer away with the same careful attention Korsk recognized from her own research notes. Very well, Lieutenant. Let's discuss the survey data. Korsk spent the following 3 days locked in her research bay, running Okonkwo's recorded readings through every variation of the threshold assessment her department's 4 centuries of refinement had produced, searching with mounting, uncomfortable urgency for the calibration error that would explain why a species facing the full weight of Imperial military posturing had produced readings indistinguishable from routine administrative correspondence. She found nothing wrong with the instrument. What she found instead, reviewing the full archive of human behavioral data her department had hastily compiled in the days following first contact, was a pattern that unsettled her considerably more than a simple instrument failure would have. The assessment isn't broken, she finally told Fleet Commander Vorn, requesting an urgent private briefing once her analysis reached a conclusion she could no longer avoid delivering. It's measuring exactly what it was designed to measure. The problem, Commander, is that it was designed around an assumption I don't believe holds true for this species. Explain, Vorn said. Every species we've previously assessed, Korsk said, exhibits fear as a form of behavioral disruption, hesitation, vocal instability, defensive posturing, some observable deviation from baseline calm. Our entire assessment framework treats the presence of that disruption as the signal we're measuring. Human physiological data suggests they experience fear through broadly comparable neurochemical mechanisms to most species we've encountered. But their behavioral expression of it appears to have been deliberately, systematically trained out of them, generation after generation, specifically in high-stakes situations. Trained out, Vorn repeated. By whom? For what purpose? Korsk pulled up a series of archived human historical records her research team had located, buried within the delegation's own publicly available cultural archive. Their own history, Commander, long before they ever left their homeworld. Emergency response training. Military doctrine emphasizing calm decision-making under lethal pressure. An entire cultural and institutional tradition built around the understanding that panic, in their own species' historical experience, got people killed considerably more often than the actual danger did. They didn't stop feeling fear, Commander. They learned, as a matter of survival, to stop letting it show, and to keep functioning regardless of whether it was present. Vorn absorbed this in silence for a long moment. You are telling me, Doctor, that our entire assessment framework cannot distinguish between a species that isn't afraid, and a species that has simply become extraordinarily skilled at not appearing afraid. I am telling you exactly that, Commander, Korsk said. And I am telling you that I have no reliable way, using any instrument currently available to this department, to determine which one we're actually facing. The realization spread through the Ascendant Word's senior staff over the following days with a slow, creeping unease that Korsk found herself, somewhat to her own professional embarrassment, largely responsible for having triggered. If Dr. Korsk's assessment is accurate, said Commander Vorn's tactical officer, during a tense senior staff briefing convened to address the implications, then this council's entire first contact doctrine, the ceremonial displays, the calibrated intimidation sequences, for centuries of refined protocol, may have never once actually measured what we believed it was measuring, at least not for this species. We have no baseline for how humans actually behave when genuinely, existentially threatened, because nothing in our initial encounter appears to have registered as existential to them at all. Or, Korsk said, it registered precisely as existential as any encounter of this kind would, and their response was simply to proceed with the negotiation anyway, because retreating or capitulating out of visible fear has never, in their own historical experience, produced better outcomes than calm, functional engagement. Vorn studied the assembled data with an expression Korsk recognized from years of professional observation as the particular controlled anxiety of a commander confronting a genuinely unfamiliar category of uncertainty. Doctor, I need your honest professional assessment, not your theoretical framework. Are we dealing with a species that does not understand the danger it is in, or a species that understands it perfectly and has simply decided not to let that understanding dictate its behavior? Korsk considered the question with the full weight of 19 years spent building an instrument now revealed, to her, as fundamentally incomplete. I believe, Commander, based on everything my team has been able to gather, that it is the latter. And I would suggest, respectfully, that the latter is considerably more concerning than the former. A species that fails to recognize danger can be corrected, informed, brought to a more accurate understanding of its situation. A species that recognizes danger fully and simply chooses not to let it govern its conduct has already made a calculation about that danger that we have no visibility into and no reliable way to influence. The tactical officer who had raised the original concern shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Doctor, forgive me, but I find myself needing to ask the question none of us seem willing to state plainly. If this species genuinely doesn't allow fear to dictate its behavior, what does dictate it? What governs their decisions, if not the same threat calculus every other species we've encountered ultimately defers to? I don't know, Korsk admitted, and found the admission considerably harder to make aloud than it had been to write in her private research notes. I suspect, based on Lieutenant Okonkwo's own account, that the answer has something to do with a considered, deliberate weighing of consequences rather than an instinctive, fear-driven response. But I want to be honest with this council about the limits of what my research can currently tell you. We have one data point, gathered from one encounter, with one representative of an entire species. I would caution strongly against this staff drawing sweeping conclusions from a sample this limited, however unsettling it may be. Vorn absorbed this with the particular weary patience of a commander accustomed to receiving answers considerably less complete than she would have preferred. Then I would ask this staff to proceed with exactly the caution Dr. Korsk recommends. We will complete the negotiation on its own merits, and we will treat every future encounter with this species as an opportunity to gather the additional data our current understanding so clearly lacks. What Fleet Commander Vorn and Dr. Korsk could not have known, watching their own instruments fail to produce a reliable answer, was that Lieutenant Sarah Okonkwo had entered the negotiation with a considerably clearer understanding of the Empire's opening display than either of them assumed. She met with Korsk directly on the fourth day, at the doctor's own request, delivered through Vorn's office with a note that read simply, "A professional curiosity, if the lieutenant is willing to indulge it." "You want to know why we weren't afraid," Okonkwo said, once they were seated, with the same unhurried directness that had characterized her entire visit. "Or rather, why we didn't act afraid, which I gather your instruments have had some difficulty distinguishing." "That's an accurate summary, Lieutenant," Korsk admitted. "We were afraid, Doctor," Okonkwo said. "I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. Standing on that shuttle deck, watching your fleet run its full intimidation sequence, every one of us felt exactly what your instruments were designed to detect. We simply made a decision, individually and collectively, a long time before any of us ever boarded that shuttle. That fear doesn't get to make our decisions for us. It gets acknowledged. It gets accounted for. It does not get to determine our behavior in a negotiation where clear thinking matters considerably more than an accurate performance of terror." "Why?" Korsk asked, genuinely curious now, professional caution giving way to something closer to the particular hunger of a scientist finally encountering an answer she hadn't anticipated. "What taught your species that distinction?" Okonkwo considered the question for a moment. "A very long history of learning, the hard way, that panic kills people considerably more efficiently than most actual threats do. We spent a long time on our own world before we ever left it, Doctor, learning that lesson in situations considerably more immediately lethal than a diplomatic first encounter. It's not that we don't feel fear. It's that we decided, collectively, a long time ago, that letting it drive the car gets people killed. So we train ourselves, generation after generation, to keep functioning regardless of whether it's present. I'd suggest, if your government finds that unsettling, that the unsettling part isn't really about us, Doctor. It's about realizing your own assessment framework was built on an assumption that calm and fearless were the same thing, and they simply aren't, for a species that's decided fear doesn't get a vote." Korsk submitted her formal findings to Imperial Central Command 6 weeks later, alongside a recommendation that would prove, in the years that followed, considerably more consequential to Imperial First Contact doctrine than the modest resource agreement that had prompted her research in the first place. "The threshold assessment," she wrote, in the report's opening summary, "remains a valid measure of behavioral fear expression for the species against which it has previously been calibrated. It is not, and cannot be treated as, a reliable measure of a species' underlying threat calculation or actual danger tolerance. I would recommend this empire adopt a considerably more cautious first contact posture toward any species exhibiting flat threshold readings going forward, treating the absence of visible fear not as evidence of ignorance or weakness, but as a potential indicator of a species that has already made a considered, informed decision about how it intends to respond to danger, regardless of what that danger actually costs them internally. The recommendation was met, in its early circulation through Imperial Central Command, with the particular institutional resistance any finding tends to encounter when it requires an established, centuries-old doctrine to admit a fundamental blind spot. But the resource agreement with the human delegation had, by that point, proceeded smoothly, the joint monitoring protocol functioning with an efficiency that several Imperial trade officials privately admitted exceeded most of the Empire's other bilateral resource arrangements, evidence, however indirect, that Korsk's underlying assessment held considerably more practical weight than institutional pride initially wanted to concede. Fleet Commander Vorn, reviewing the final report before its formal submission, found herself adding a personal note to the file, addressed to whichever future commander might eventually encounter this particular species again, under circumstances considerably less amicable than the Vessic Corridor negotiation had turned out to be. To whoever reads this next, do not mistake their calm for an absence of understanding. Every officer present at this first encounter left with the same unsettling impression, difficult to fully articulate in a formal report, but worth stating plainly regardless. This is not a species that fails to recognize danger. This is a species that has already decided, long before you ever meet them, exactly how much of that danger they are willing to let show, and exactly how much it is going to cost you if you mistake that restraint for fear. A year later, Dr. Yevakorsk stood once more in an observation gallery, this time reviewing readings from an entirely different first contact encounter, a newly discovered species, considerably more conventional in its behavioral response to the Empire's standard opening display, its readings tracking neatly along the familiar curves her original instrument had been built to measure. She found herself, watching those familiar, comfortable readings scroll past, thinking of Sarah Okonkwo's calm, unhurried explanation, delivered across a small meeting room 6 weeks into a first contact that had quietly reshaped 4 centuries of Imperial doctrine. Her revised framework, formally adopted by Imperial Central Command some months after her initial submission, now included a supplementary protocol specifically designed to flag flat threshold readings for additional, more cautious review, a small, unglamorous addition to a much larger body of established science, but one that she suspected, turning it over with the particular satisfaction of a researcher who had finally built something that worked, would prove considerably more important than any of the framework's earlier refinements. Doctor, her junior technician said, from the adjoining console, I've got a query from the diplomatic corps. They're asking whether the human resource agreement precedent should be applied to the current negotiation. Korsk considered the question for a moment, thinking of Okonkwo's steady, unhurried voice, and of a fleet commander's private note about restraint and its cost. Tell them, she said, that every negotiation deserves its own careful assessment, rather than a borrowed precedent. But you can also tell them, if they ask for my personal recommendation, that the Empire has done considerably better, in my professional experience, when it treats a calm opponent as one that already understands exactly what it's risking, rather than one that simply hasn't noticed yet. The END.